Good evening, listeners. Pull your chairs closer to the radio tonight, for we have a tale that comes to us from the dusty archives of mystery. A story that began in the autumn of 1923 in a small New England town where the maple leaves had turned the color of dried blood, and the wind carried whispers of secrets long buried.
Our story centers on Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a respected historian who had dedicated her life to preserving the past. She was a woman of 43 years, with silver threading through her auburn hair and eyes that held the weight of countless untold stories. Dr. Thornfield had recently acquired something extraordinary, a centuries-old stone wall that was being demolished from an estate in Salem, Massachusetts.
This was no ordinary wall, dear listeners. Local records spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the Wailing Wall for reasons that had been lost to time. The stones themselves were massive, quarried from some unknown location and fitted together with a precision that seemed almost impossible for the era in which they were laid. Dr. Thornfield had purchased the entire structure and had it transported, stone by stone, to her property in Millbrook.
The historian's intention was noble. She wished to preserve this piece of history, to study its construction and uncover its origins. Her colleagues at the university thought her obsession with the wall was merely academic curiosity taken to an extreme. But Dr. Thornfield knew there was something more. She had felt it the moment she first laid eyes on those ancient stones.
The wall was rebuilt in her backyard, a serpentine structure that curved through her garden like the spine of some slumbering beast. It stood 7 feet tall and stretched nearly 100 feet in length. The stones were a dark gray granite, almost black in certain light, and they seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Even on the brightest days, the wall cast shadows that appeared deeper and longer than they should have been.
Dr. Thornfield began her research immediately. She pored over colonial records, church documents, and ship manifests. She discovered that the wall had been part of the Whitmore estate, built sometime in the late 1600s by a man named Cornelius Whitmore, who had arrived from England with considerable wealth and an air of mystery that never quite dissipated.
The records showed that Whitmore had been a collector of sorts. Antiquities, rare books, and what the documents euphemistically called curiosities of natural philosophy. But it was what Dr. Thornfield found in the margins of an old parish record that made her blood run cold. A note, written in faded ink, mentioned that Whitmore's servants had complained of voices in the stones and weeping that came from within the very walls of the estate.
At first, Dr. Thornfield dismissed these accounts as superstition, the kind of folklore that grew around any structure of unusual appearance or uncertain origin. But as the days passed and she spent more time studying the wall, she began to notice things that defied logical explanation. The stones seemed to shift in color as the day progressed, sometimes appearing almost translucent in the early morning light.
More disturbing still were the sounds. It began as a barely perceptible humming, so faint that Dr. Thornfield thought it might be the wind passing through the gaps in the stonework. But the sound persisted even on perfectly still days, and it seemed to grow stronger as darkness fell. By the end of her first week with the wall, she could no longer deny what she was hearing, a low, mournful wailing that seemed to emanate from within the stones themselves.
Dr. Thornfield was a woman of science, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural explanations. She convinced herself that there must be a rational cause for the phenomena she was experiencing. Perhaps the stones contained some mineral that resonated at specific frequencies. Perhaps there were cavities within the wall that created acoustic effects. She documented everything meticulously, measuring temperatures, recording sounds, and photographing the wall at different times of day.
But the wall had other mysteries to reveal. One morning, while examining the base of the structure, Dr. Thornfield discovered something that made her question everything she thought she knew about historical construction techniques. The mortar between the stones was not lime-based, as it should have been for that era. Instead, it appeared to be some kind of organic compound, dark, resinous, and unlike anything she had encountered in her years of study.
She carefully extracted a sample and took it to the university laboratory for analysis. The results were baffling. The substance contained elements that shouldn't have been available to colonial builders, and its composition suggested it had been designed not just to hold the stones together, but to seal something in, or perhaps to keep something out.
As autumn deepened into winter, the wailing from the wall grew more pronounced. Dr. Thornfield found herself drawn to her window each night, listening to the sorrowful sounds that seemed to carry an almost human quality of grief and longing. Sleep became elusive, and she began to spend her nights in the garden, sitting on a bench she had placed facing the wall, as if keeping vigil.
It was during one of these nocturnal observations that Dr. Thornfield made a discovery that would change everything. The moon was full that night, casting stark shadows across her yard, when she noticed something extraordinary. The shadows cast by the wall were not random. They formed patterns, symbols that seemed to shift and change as the moon moved across the sky.
Dr. Thornfield rushed inside to fetch her camera and notebooks. By the time she returned, the shadows had changed again, but she was determined to document this phenomenon. Night after night, she photographed the shadow patterns, creating a detailed record of what appeared to be some kind of symbolic language written in darkness itself. The symbols began to repeat in cycles, appearing to follow lunar phases and seasonal changes. Dr. Thornfield realized she was looking at a calendar of sorts, or perhaps a ritual schedule carved not in stone, but in the very way the stones interacted with light and shadow. The implications were staggering. Someone had designed this wall not just as a barrier, but as a sophisticated astronomical instrument. As winter gave way to spring, Dr. Thornfield's research took on an urgency she couldn't quite explain. A wailing from the wall had grown stronger, and she had begun to detect variations in tone and rhythm that suggested, impossible as it seemed, multiple voices. Sometimes the sound seemed conversational, as if unseen beings were communicating across centuries through the medium of stone and shadow. Dr. Thornfield's health began to suffer from her obsession. She grew thin and pale, her colleagues at the university expressing concern about her increasingly erratic behavior. She spoke of little else but the wall, filling notebooks with observations that grew more and more difficult for others to understand. Her handwriting, once precise and scholarly, became wild and urgent. One April evening, as spring rain drummed against her windows, Dr. Thornfield made a breakthrough that would prove to be both triumph and tragedy. She had been studying the shadow patterns for months, and suddenly the symbols began to make sense. They weren't random marks, they were coordinates, star charts, and what appeared to be a countdown to a specific date and time. According to her calculations, the countdown pointed to the vernal equinox of the following year, exactly 300 years from the date the wall had first been constructed. Dr. Thornfield realized she was looking at evidence of a plan that had been set in motion centuries ago, a design so patient and far-reaching that it spanned generations. But what was supposed to happen on that date? Dr. Thornfield threw herself into research with renewed intensity, searching for any historical records that might provide clues. She discovered that Cornelius Whitmore had disappeared on the vernal equinox of 1724, exactly 50 years after building the wall. His servants had reported that he had been found standing before the wall at dawn, and by evening he was simply gone. More disturbing still, the record showed that every 50 years since Whitmore's disappearance, someone connected to the wall had vanished on the same date. The pattern was consistent and undeniable. The wall was not just counting down to something, it was collecting something, or someone, at regular intervals. As the fateful date approached, Dr. Thornfield found herself torn between scientific curiosity and growing dread. She knew she should document whatever was going to happen, but she also understood that she might be the next in the chain of disappearances. The wailing from the wall had become constant now, a chorus of voices that seemed to be calling to her. Dr. Thornfield made her preparations with the methodical care of a true scholar. She sealed copies of all her research in a safe deposit box at the bank, left detailed instructions with her lawyer, and arranged for her estate to be donated to the university. If she were to disappear like the others, at least her work would survive to warn future investigators. The night before the vernal equinox, Dr. Thornfield sat in her garden one final time, listening to the wall's ancient song. The voices seemed clearer now, more distinct, and she could almost make out individual words in languages she didn't recognize. As dawn approached, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, as if she was finally approaching the end of a journey that had begun long before she was born. When the sun rose on the morning of the vernal equinox, Dr. Thornfield stood before the wall with her notebook in hand, ready to document whatever was about to unfold. The shadows cast by the morning light formed the most complex pattern she had ever seen, a mandala of darkness that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. What happened next, dear listeners, can only be pieced together from the evidence Dr. Thornfield left behind. Her final notebook entry, written in a hand that grew increasingly shaky as the words progressed, described a growing awareness that the wall was not just a repository of the past, but a doorway to somewhere else entirely. She wrote of seeing faces in the stones, hearing her name called by voices that seemed to come from immense distances. The wall, she came to understand, was not wailing in sorrow, it was calling out in welcome, inviting her to join those who had come before, to become part of something larger than individual existence. Dr. Margaret Thornfield was found 3 days later by her concerned colleagues, seated peacefully on her garden bench facing the wall. She appeared to be sleeping, but no amount of calling or shaking could wake her. The doctor who examined her found no signs of illness or injury. She simply seemed to have slipped away, as if her consciousness had traveled to some distant place while her body remained behind. The wall itself had changed. The stones, once dark and imposing, now appeared lighter, almost luminous in certain light. The wailing had stopped completely, replaced by what witnesses described as a gentle humming, like a lullaby sung by the wind itself. Some said they could hear Dr. Thornfield's voice among the harmonies, peaceful and content. Dr. Thornfield lived for another 30 years in that strange state between sleep and waking, cared for by nurses who reported that she often smiled and moved her lips as if engaged in conversation with invisible companions. She passed away peacefully in her sleep on a quiet Tuesday morning, and was buried in the town cemetery according to her wishes. The wall remains in Millbrook to this day, now part of a small historical park maintained by the town. Visitors often comment on the sense of peace they feel there, and many report hearing what sounds like gentle conversation carried on the wind. The shadow patterns still appear with the changing seasons, but they seem softer now, less urgent than they once were. Some say that Dr. Thornfield solved the mystery of the Wailing Wall, not through research or documentation, but by understanding that some questions can only be answered through experience. The wall had been calling across centuries, gathering those with the wisdom and courage to listen, creating a community that existed beyond the boundaries of time and space. Others maintain that the whole affair was nothing more than the tragic result of academic obsession taken too far, that Dr. Thornfield's fate was the product of isolation and overwork rather than supernatural intervention. They point to the lack of physical evidence, the absence of any concrete proof that the wall possessed properties beyond those of ordinary stone and mortar. But those who visit the wall today often come away with a different impression. They speak of feeling welcomed rather than threatened, of sensing the presence of countless others who had stood in that same spot and felt the pull of something greater than themselves. The wall, they say, no longer wails, it sings. The truth, as is so often the case with mysteries from the past, remains elusive. Was the Wailing Wall a doorway to another realm, a sophisticated instrument designed by minds far more advanced than those of its supposed era? Or was it simply an old stone structure that became the focus of one woman's imagination until that imagination consumed her? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between these possibilities, but in understanding that both can be true simultaneously. Dr. Margaret Thornfield found what she was looking for in those ancient stones, not just historical knowledge, but connection, purpose, and ultimately peace. Whether that peace came from this world or another may be less important than the fact that she found it at all. The legacy of Dr. Thornfield's research lives on in the archives of the university, a testament to the power of curiosity and the courage required to pursue knowledge wherever it might lead. Her notebooks, filled with careful observations and growing wonder, remind us that the greatest mysteries are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the eyes to see and the heart to understand. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of our tale of the Wailing Wall. Like all the best mysteries, it leaves us with more questions than answers, more wonder than certainty. In our modern age of electric lights and mechanical sounds, it's easy to forget that the world still holds secrets, still offers invitations to those brave enough to accept them. The next time you encounter something that doesn't quite fit the patterns of ordinary experience, a sound that seems to come from nowhere, a shadow that falls in an impossible direction, a wall that seems to remember things from long ago, perhaps you'll think of Dr. Margaret Thornfield and her patient vigil in a garden in Millbrook. Perhaps you'll remember that the boundary between the known and unknown is not as solid as we sometimes believe, and that the greatest adventures often begin not with grand expeditions to distant lands, but with the simple act of paying attention to the mysteries that surround us every day. Until we meet again in the realm of shadow and story, this is your host bidding you good night. May your dreams be filled with wonder, and may you always have the courage to listen when the walls begin to sing. Sleep well, dear listeners, and remember, sometimes the most important journeys
are the ones that take us not to new places, but to new ways of seeing the places we thought we already knew. The wall still stands in Millbrook, still casting its shadows, still singing its ancient songs. For those with ears to hear, it's singing still.